So, as Justine has mentioned, I will be talking to you today about a slightly new way of thinking about teaching based on theatre and film. So that's why it's a creative perspective, not necessarily because I thought of it, but because it's based on creative people. And to do this, we'll be looking at some examples from Supermind second edition, the new course from Cambridge. So just before we begin, because it's not going to be the kind of session where I give you lots and lots of new activities, what I'd like you to do to start, and just to make sure that you know how to find the chat box, is to write the name of an activity that your students enjoy or that you enjoy and you use a lot in your classrooms. Could you just write that in the chat box, please? And we're going to come back to this list a little bit later on. So if there's an activity that you do quite often in your classroom that has a name, write it in the chat box, and we will review this list later on in the session. I'll give you a minute just to think. And while you're thinking, let me just tell you what's going to come up in the next 40 minutes or so. So we're going to be considering various metaphors for teaching and why these metaphors are important and what we can learn from them. And then, as Justina mentioned, I'm going to show you one particular metaphor, one particular way of looking at teaching, which has to do with Hollywood. So I'm going to call it the Hollywood metaphor. We'll look at how you can apply that metaphor to communicative language teaching, and then also how you can apply that metaphor to digital pedagogy. And as Justina mentioned, at the end, there'll be the opportunity to answer your questions or have your questions answered. So if you have questions as we go through the session, please write them in the Q&A box and we'll come to them at the end. So thank you very much, Vanessa. You've got us off the ground. So bingo, tic-tac-toe or graffiti wall. Lovely activities that you use in your classroom. Anyone else want to volunteer the name of a few activities? It can be anything. Oh, escape rooms. That sounds exciting, Barbara. Fantastic. I'm going to try to remember the names of these to talk about later on. So we've got bingo, tic-tac-toe, escape rooms. I'll just give another few seconds to see if we've got any more. Role plays, thanks, Angelica. Good point. Good point, Michael. So just remember, when you write in the chat box, you need to change the settings so that it goes to everyone and not just to host and panelists, because that means that I can see all of your wonderful answers, but other people can't. So just change the settings so that it says to everyone. Thanks for pointing that out, Michael. Okay, and a treasure hunt is what Taraya says. Michael can't change the settings. We've locked it down so that you can't hack anything, Michael. Well, so I'll be sure to read things out from the chat box. Thanks for letting me know that. Okay, well, let's move on then and talk about these metaphors for teaching. So there are lots of different ways that we can think about what we do, and the ways that we can think about our role in the classroom and our students' roles in the classroom. And on your screen, you see two possible metaphors for teaching. Can you just have a look at these and think about what is the metaphor? Who is the teacher in each metaphor, and who are the students, or what are the students in each of these? Feel free to write your answers in the chat. And if you can, if you're able to change the settings, then do, so that everybody can see. Who is the teacher in each of these metaphors? Mala says both. So both, what do you mean by that, Mala? Who is the teacher? Are they both teachers? Is everybody that you see in these pictures a teacher? Okay, thank you, Sonia. So Sonia suggests that the teacher in these pictures is the gardener and the coach. So let's start with the gardener metaphor. If the teacher's a gardener, then who are the students? All right, thanks, Sonia. So Sonia says that the students are the plants. So this is quite a well-known metaphor, and it's the origin of the word kindergarten, where the teacher's the gardener and we're nurturing the students. We're trying to create the right conditions for them to grow and develop. Obviously, you can't force your plants to grow, you can't force your students to develop, but you can create the right conditions that encourage them to do so. So that's one possible way of thinking about our teaching, that we're gardeners and our students are plants. In the other one, we are the coach, the sports coach. And obviously in this scenario, our students are the players. And this suggests a slightly different relationship, right? Because you're maybe in this scenario trying to motivate the players, you're trying to organize them perhaps. We do some organizing, don't we, of our students in the classroom, telling them where to sit or what they need to do. So you can see that both of these represent aspects of what we do as teachers, and both of them have some truth to them. But you might go in the same lesson, you might do a little bit of gardening and creating the right conditions for your students, but you might also do a little bit of sports coaching and trying to motivate your students or trying to organize them. You can perform both of these roles at different times in your teaching. Barbara says she prefers the sports coach one. Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on the age of your students as well. So maybe if you're teaching adult students or older students, perhaps you feel that the gardener metaphor is less appropriate to you. But both of these are quite well-known metaphors for teaching. Here are a couple more teaching metaphors, and these are less positive, I think. So again, in the chat box, see if you can suggest what's the metaphor here and who is the teacher in each case. Welcome if you're just joining us. We're talking about different metaphors for teaching. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so putting out fires, the firefighter metaphor. So obviously not real fires, you know, hopefully you don't have actual flames burning in your classroom, but you're trying to put out different, you're trying to deal with various difficult situations perhaps in the classroom. You know, maybe you have a student who doesn't understand and needs some help to move forward in the lesson. On one table, you have two students fighting. On another table, you have another student who's just arrived late. So that to some extent, acting as a firefighter in the classroom is this view of a teacher as constantly trying to deal with challenging situations. So you can see that that's quite a negative view of teaching. The second one, yeah, as Mala has said here, that it's the idea of the teacher as a clown or as an entertainer, that your job is to kind of keep the children entertained and keep them happy. Again, quite a negative view of teaching, but perhaps you might recognize a grain of truth to both of these, that at times you might feel like a firefighter or you might feel like an entertainer, even if that's not what you feel your role is really about. So there are, you know, these metaphors can be positive or negative, but they all reveal something generally about teaching. And our aim with these is to try and keep our thinking about teaching fresh so that we don't get stuck in the same patterns of thought, and that we step into the classroom thinking about our role in a positive way and thinking about how we can help our students in the best way. So with that, let me introduce you to a slightly different metaphor. And I'm going to call it the Hollywood metaphor, but there are various different names I think we could give it. Let's start with 5 relatively famous people that I think we can divide into 2 groups. So there are 2 ways that we can divide these 5 people up. Any ideas what they might be? How could you separate these 5 people? Answers in the chat once again, please. So men and women is one way. Thanks, Sonia. But Vanessa and sorry have got the answer that I'm looking for. We're looking at directors and actors. So if I just move them around for you. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see the actors, and on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the directors. And I think some of them cross over slightly. Quentin Tarantino has done some acting as well. But in general, we've got actors and we've got directors. So let's think a little bit more about these roles and what they're each doing. So actors do three things, and I'm simplifying a lot. I'm not an actor myself, so I'm apologize to any actors in the audience here. But what actors do is, first of all, prepare, right? So they learn their lines and they get into character. You know, maybe they have to get into costume, maybe they have to get their hair and makeup done. They go through a process of preparing to get into character and to perform their role. Okay. Absolutely, Mala. They have to learn their script by heart, right? They have to learn their lines. The second thing that they do then is rehearse. So they might do this if they're in a theatre, then they might have rehearsals in private before the audience is invited, right, on the stage. If they're working on a set, working on a film, then maybe they have several takes of a particular scene before they get to the point that they can put it in the film. So either way, they're rehearsing, right? So they're acting out their performance. They're getting feedback from the director, and they're improving all the time until it reaches the point that it's as good as it can be. And so then the final thing that they do is perform, whether they're performing in a theatre, on a stage, or in front of a camera that's being recorded for a film. This is the process that the actors get to. And of course, the preparation and the rehearsal are leading towards the performance. They support the performance. And the performance is the kind of the ultimate goal. It's the end of the journey. For directors, what do directors do? Well, they help to provide the context and they set the scene for the actors. So everything that's around there that the actors need to do their job, the director has some control over that, over the costumes and the lighting and all of these things. The directors are also kind of behind the camera. We don't see them performing. So we're not really interested in what the director has to say. We want to hear from the actors, right? So the director is somebody who takes a step back and helps the actors do what they do. And finally, very importantly, the director provides feedback. So if they think that the actors should say their lines in a slightly different way or stand in a slightly different place, then they give that feedback during rehearsals in order to improve the performance later on. Mala says that she's an actress. So we have an actress in the audience, and it's not an easy task, as you say, Mala. Okay, so we have actors and directors, and hopefully you're starting to see the parallels between students and teachers, and you can see some similarities in what we want our students to do. So in this metaphor, the students are the actors. So as we know, students also need to prepare. They need to learn their lines. So they need to learn about grammar. They need to learn some vocabulary. They need to improve their pronunciation and so on. They need to rehearse. And this means using the language in the classroom, making some mistakes, getting feedback from you. And all of this is preparation for performing. But of course, our students are not actors. They're not going to go and be in a film. Or maybe they will, but that's not part of what we're preparing them for. The performance for students is using English in the real world. So it's leaving the classroom and then going and getting a job in English, or passing an exam in English, or going on holiday and using English. That's what we mean by performance when we're talking about our students. When it comes to teachers, if we're the directors, then we also need to create recognizable contexts for language learning. So we need to set out the topic of the lesson or create the context that we expect our students to use the language in. We also need to create opportunities for practice in our lessons. So we're providing opportunities for rehearsal so that students can use the language and get some feedback. We need to give them that feedback. so that they can improve. And all of this is helping the students prepare for going out into the world and performing and using their English. So just to summarize all of this, this is what we are talking about if we're kind of taking this view of our roles as teachers and of our students as learners, that our students are aiming to prepare, rehearse, and then perform once they leave the classroom and use their English. And we're trying to set the scene, create opportunities for practice, and give feedback. Obviously, we're not talking about students actually acting. So when we're talking about preparing them or helping them rehearse, they're not rehearsing a film, they're not rehearsing a play, they're just practicing using English. And then when they perform, it's using that English in the real world. So how does this affect our actual teaching? Let's think about this and think about it in terms of, first of all, of communicative language teaching. So there's another metaphor for teaching and learning that quite often comes up when we talk about language learning, and it's not a very communicative metaphor. It's the idea of the student as a computer. And if you think about some of the words that we use to describe language learning, like input or output or error or instruction checking, all of these kinds of words, the implicit argument here is that our students are a bit like computers, that you give them some data and they do some processing and then they spit out the right answer. And the focus here in this metaphor is on students' cognition. It's not on communication. So it's not a very communicative metaphor. So this is something that we need to try and move away from. And our Hollywood metaphor takes us to a different place, right? So it takes us to a place where students are seen as creative and communicative, where they lead the process of language learning, they have autonomy, and the focus is on communication. It's not on cognition. So, a quick test. Can you remember what our students are doing if we think of them as actors? The three things. Answers in the chat box. This is just a test to see if you're awake, still following me. Okay, yeah. So learn their lines, rehearse, and perform. Excellent. Well done, guys. So prepare, rehearse, perform. And of course, as we said, all of these lead towards performance. So performance is the ultimate goal. And this is kind of our first golden rule. I'm going to show you 3 golden rules as we go through. So the first one is that performance, and when I say performance, I mean using English, that's the student's ultimate goal. It's the reason that we have the preparation and the rehearsal. And it's the reason for your students taking their classes, really, isn't it? They come to you so that they can use English in the real world. So what that means is that we're going to focus on the preparation and the rehearsal side, because that's what happens in the classroom. That's the part that we have control over. And what I'm going to do now is show you a few activities. And what I'd like you to do is tell me if it's a preparation activity or a rehearsal activity. So is it more like an actor learning their lines, or is it more like an actor using what they know and rehearsing and preparing for a real performance? As we go through, I'm going to show you examples from Supermind 2nd edition. This is the book that Justina mentioned at the beginning of the session. And this is a 7-level course for your young learners that takes them up to B1. So more on this at the end of the session, but for now, just to say that this is the course that the examples come from. So here's your first one. Is this a preparation activity or a rehearsal activity? On the right-hand side, you've got the page of the book that this comes from. And at the top of the page, you might be able to see that we've got some vocabulary. So students learn some vocabulary. And the activity that I've highlighted is at the bottom of the page. It says, play the chain game. And you can see that students are using the vocabulary that they've learned to play this game. So is this preparation or is it rehearsal? What do you think? Okay, we've got both answers. Some of you saying rehearsal, some of you saying preparation. Samantha says it's both. Hedging your bets there, Samantha. Okay, so this one is preparation because it's essentially a drill. It's about learning the lines. It's about learning the vocabulary. So when students play this game, it's quite a controlled activity. They're not really improvising. They're not using all of their language that they know. And that's why we would refer to this as preparation. So think of preparation as similar to controlled practice, right? So this one's preparation. Here's the next example. Again, on the right-hand side, you can see the whole page that this activity comes from. So there's a little bit of reading. Halfway down the page, we focus on some grammar, and the grammar is was and were, or wasn't and weren't. And then at the bottom of the page, we have this activity, number 4, talk about the dinosaurs. Is this preparation or rehearsal? Okay, again, some of you saying both, but most of you, I think, are saying rehearsal, which is great. So in this activity, so this is rehearsal, and it's rehearsal because you can see that the students have a lot more freedom. So we're just saying, talk about the dinosaurs. We have some suggestions as to what they could say, but your students have a lot of freedom to expand on this. Hopefully they're going to use the target language, and they're going to be using was and were in order to talk about the dinosaurs. But you can see that there's lots of other language that they could be using to do this task. So there's a lot more improvisation here, a lot more freedom. So this is more like freer practice, and that's why this is more of a rehearsal task. Excellent. Example number 3. So this is not so much from the book. This is an actual video. So you've got a couple of screenshots from the video. And in this video, we see Greg the gecko having a conversation with his friend. And the box at the bottom is for students to repeat this conversation. So it's like the conversation has a kind of rhythm. It's a little bit like a chant. And students have to reenact this conversation and say what Greg the gecko says in his video. Is this preparation or rehearsal? All right, fantastic. So everybody's saying preparation, which is the right answer. Well done. So this is quite controlled. You can see that it's just about the students learning their lines. Not just about learning the vocabulary or the grammar, but also about repeating the kind of intonation that they hear Greg the gecko using. So it's also about working on the phonology of the language. But this is all about preparation. It's very controlled. And maybe later on, we would help our students use this in a different task for rehearsal. Super. Okay, and the last one, this is a bit trickier. So what you see here is a story page. You can see that the students have a story to read. And then at the end, they've got various tasks to complete. So let me try and just zoom in for you on these tasks. Students need to complete some sentences to check that they've understood the story. They need to listen to a summary of the story and write the 4 differences. And then task number 5 is when they need to talk together about this topic. Are all sea animals dangerous? So my question for you is about task number 5. Is task number 5 preparation or rehearsal? Great. Okay, so Mercedes and Samantha straight in with rehearsal. So is Sonia, Vanessa, Cecilia, great. So number 5 is a rehearsal task. If we switch to number 3, complete the sentences. Is that rehearsal or preparation? Yeah, that's preparation. Good. So you see that these controlled kinds of exercises are the preparation, and the freer stuff is rehearsal. So nothing especially new here, right? Because we already have this idea of controlled and free practice, but we're just thinking of it in a slightly different way as part of this Hollywood metaphor. This is another page, and I want to use this to highlight something that I think we've seen in that last example as well, which is the way that we move from preparation tasks into rehearsal tasks. So in the same way that actors first do their preparation, they first learn their lines, they get into costume, and then they rehearse, that's what we're doing here as well. So we have a number of tasks here as part of this lesson that you can see our preparation. So taking a look here at exercise 1, we've got some vocabulary that students might need later on in the lesson. We've got a nice controlled speaking task, so talking about the pictures, but there's a lot of support for the students in terms of the words that they'll need. Then we're using this vocabulary as part of a reading task. So still preparation, but finally as task number 5, and this is the kind of main part of the lesson, even though it's a relatively small part of what you see on the page, we have a project and students need to make a leaflet about climate change. So this project is our rehearsal task. Even though it's writing, remember that the performance of English or using English in the real world involves writing as well as speaking. So this is our rehearsal task, and we've got all of the preparation beforehand before we get to this. So the key thing here, I think, is that we have these two types of communicative tasks. We've got preparation tasks, and these are quite controlled, where we want students to practice a particular aspect of language or maybe a particular skill. And then we've got rehearsal tasks, and these are freer, and they mimic real life communicative situations. And what is really important is that students need both kinds of tasks in order to be successful language learners. So if you just rehearse, so if you just prepare, if you're constantly just learning your lines, you're not going to be able to perform because you need that rehearsal time. And if you just rehearse and you haven't already learnt your lines, then the rehearsal will never get better, the performance will never get better. So we need both to be successful actors and also to be successful language learners. So at this point, think back to those activities that you told me about at the very beginning of the session. We had bingo, we had tic-tac-toe, we had role plays, we had the escape room idea. Think about your activity. Was it a preparation activity or was it a rehearsal activity? Okay, so Vanessa said that projects are rehearsal, which is true. Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, that's great, Barbara. So your escape room idea is a rehearsal kind of scenario. Your students are using all of their language and having to improvise with that language. Angelica says role plays might be both. And that's a really interesting point, Angelica, because I think you're right. If we get into a situation where your students are kind of acting, where they are kind of preparing lines and then practicing lines and then performing them, then that's actually more of a kind of preparation task. If they're kind of preparing the ideas and just preparing the character, and then when they perform, the language is spontaneous, then it's rehearsal. But if it's a situation where they're kind of memorizing the actual words that they say, not so much. Yeah, that's a great point, Justina. So role play of something like Greg the Gecko is preparation. Yes, and Angelica says if they create, it's rehearsal. That's the key point, right? It's that creative aspect is what takes us towards real language learning, because all language use is creative. If you're sitting in a coffee shop talking to your friend, you're kind of creating that conversation, co-creating that conversation on the spot. And the more that we move towards that creative aspect, the more realistic our language use is, or our students' language use is. Super. So that brings us to golden rule number 2, right? Which is that we want to move our students from preparation to rehearsal as part of their lessons. Let's think now about the kind of final stage and what we might do when it comes to digital pedagogy with our students. So many of you, I'm sure, have been teaching online. Even if you're not teaching online, maybe your students are doing their homework online, or you're using digital devices in the classroom. How does this work if we have this idea of rehearsal and performance? The golden rule here, golden rule number 3, is to understand why you're using a particular tool. Is it for preparation or is it for rehearsal? And if I show you some examples of the digital tools for Supermind 2nd edition, once again, maybe you can tell me if these are preparation or rehearsal. So this is an example of a task from our digital learning platform, Cambridge One. This is at cambridgeone.org. And this is one of the tasks that students would do if they are studying with Supermind 2nd edition. Okay, so Samantha says this is preparation. I'll just give the rest of you a moment to decide what you think this is. Is it preparation or rehearsal? Great. So Mala and Mercedes also say preparation. Good. It's a controlled practice task, isn't it? So it's all about learning the lines, learning the vocabulary. In this case, the word library. Here's another one. And you can probably see that this is also preparation. It's controlled practice, working on the syntax of questions, question forms. This 3rd example is from a game. So in this game, students control the dragon, and they have to fly the dragon through the correct banner in order to choose the right answer. Is this preparation or rehearsal? Playing a game like this? Yeah, thanks Vanessa, thanks Samantha. So this is preparation as well. It's, once again, it's fairly controlled practice. But what you can see from these 3 examples is that when we go online, what we tend to get is preparation tasks, not so much of the rehearsal. There might be opportunities for rehearsal online, but very often we're focusing on preparation, partly because of the technology itself, partly also because we're assigning this kind of stuff to our students for homework. So they're doing this at home, they're doing it on their own, and they may not be able to interact so much or interact freely with other people when they're doing it. So digital preparation activities includes stuff like this that I've just showed you from Cambridge One, but also quizzes. So you might be familiar with sites like Quizlet or Kahoot or WordWall that allow students just to practice what they've already learned, whether that's for grammar or vocabulary, in fairly controlled ways. But it doesn't have to involve a website. So another activity that you might do that's also a preparation activity is shadow speaking. And this involves giving students a recording, like a video or an audio recording, and also giving them the text of that recording. So it's quite short, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute of somebody speaking, and it could be something that you've recorded. The students are able to listen, but they're also able to read, and their task is to re-record that text and try and copy the pronunciation and the rhythms and the intonation of what they hear. So They don't have to improvise, they don't have to create necessarily their own language, but what they're doing is trying to practice speaking someone else's words. So that would be a digital preparation activity. So this brings us back to golden rule number 2. And once again, I'm just going to check that you can remember, that you're following along. Can anybody remember what golden rule number 2 was? No, I can jog your memories, don't worry. Oh, well done, Michael. Gold star. We're moving from preparation to rehearsal. Well done, Angelica, as well. So we want this balance. And if we're in a situation where we have a lot of preparation activities, which might be the case if you're giving your students work online, then we need to make sure that there's a balance of rehearsal when they come to the classroom. So it's fantastic if your students are doing these kinds of tasks at home for homework, but when they come to your class, when they come to your lessons, then they need to use that in a rehearsal context. And a lot of your ideas, like the role plays or the escape room idea, would be a great way of kind of following up on preparation like this, if your students have done that at home. But there are other digital rehearsal activities that you might use. So a really good one is having your students simply record themselves, recording a monologue. They could do that just using a mobile phone. Most mobile phones have a voice recorder, or they could use something like rocky.com, where they can create a character on the screen, they record their voice, and then the character will be the one who kind of speaks that. So that's a good option for kids. Maybe something like a digital presentation. So it could simply be your students giving a presentation to video, or it could be something like a paper slide video where they prepare the slides on paper and then the camera only shows the paper slides. And as they move through the presentation, they just have a stack of paper and they take off each paper from the stack and then talk about that slide. Flipgrid, yeah, Taraya's mentioned Flipgrid. Similar idea, similar way of doing the same thing, of having your students delivering something which is more creative, more spontaneous, but with that kind of digital support. Video recordings, as long as it's something that allows for improvisation. So we mentioned that role plays can kind of take us into preparation tasks if your students are learning the lines that they say. And if you're kind of recording a film, if you have a kind of film project with your students, that can be a great thing to do, but what's in the film is probably preparation tasks. Your students are learning lines and then they're just delivering them to camera. So if you choose something that allows for more improvisation, so it might be something like an interview where you have one student interviewing another, that would be more spontaneous, but it's still a kind of clearly defined video genre. And the last option might be dedicated tools like Write and Improve or Speak and Improve from Cambridge, where your students can write, they can produce something creative and spontaneous. They can also speak and do the same thing, and they'll get feedback from the website on their work. And this is a great tool, I think, as a kind of initial feedback stage. Your students can do this online, get the feedback from the online tool, and then when they come to the classroom or when they come to you, you're able to give that higher level feedback that only a human being can give. So another good option for rehearsal activities. So just to wrap up as we come to the end. Sorry, ask, is it free? Yes, both have free functionality. So you can go to those sites, Write and Improve and Speak and Improve, and you can get a feel for what they can do. And if you want the full functionality of the site, you have to pay. but you can definitely get quite a lot for free. So let's just wrap up and recap what we've seen. We've considered this Hollywood role, these actor and director roles, as metaphors for teaching. We've considered how those relate to communicative language teaching, and you guys were able to identify those preparation tasks and the rehearsal tasks. We've seen our 3 golden rules that you need to remember. And we've also applied that metaphor for digital pedagogy as well. Just to recap, these are the 3 things that actors, that students do in their roles as actors. Can you remember the 3 things that teachers do in their roles as directors? Well done, Samantha. So we set the scene, we create that context, don't we? Maybe with the help of our course materials, but we still set the scene. We create opportunities for rehearsal, yeah, or for practice. And we give feedback to our students. So lots of similarities, I think, between ourselves and film directors in those roles. Just to recap those golden rules for you, the key thing, I think, the key difference between this metaphor and our previous terminology of controlled practice and free practice is remembering that the ultimate goal of our students is performance. So there's this kind of, this point in the distance that we keep in mind and that we remember when we're thinking of our students as actors, that eventually everything they're doing with us in the classroom is leading towards that point where they go out into the real world and use their English. Golden rule number 2 is that we want that balance between preparation and rehearsal, ideally in every lesson, but you might be able to adjust that balance depending on what your students are doing at home. So if they're doing lots of preparation work at home, you can shift the balance in your lessons towards rehearsal. And when it comes to digital pedagogy, really understanding why you're using a particular tool, and is it for preparation or is it for rehearsal, and what do you need to do to keep the balance. Okay, and I'm going to stop talking there. Samantha said such a clear metaphor, and I'm really pleased about that, Samantha. I'm glad you like it. I hope that you find it useful as you go back to your classrooms. And just to remind you that the examples we saw were from Supermind's 2nd edition, which is out now, and you can learn more at cambridge.org/superminds2. But yeah, back to you, Justina.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a brilliant metaphor, and I totally agree with Samantha and other teachers here in the chat that it's a really clear, having these kind of roles clearly defined. It's a great way of taking a fresh look at teaching. We have some time now to answer your questions. So I wonder if I can start with one from me. While everyone's thinking about their questions, I'm going to take advantage of my privilege here. So the actor metaphor is great. We're talking about performance, we're talking about the kind of end goal, but how does it work for beginners where the language level, perhaps their creativity is not as advanced, and they can perhaps only move within that preparation area? How do we move them from that towards something more creative like rehearsal and the ultimate?
That's a great question, Justina. Yeah, I think so. I think it's important that we do have students rehearsing and thinking about their eventual performance right from beginner level. And if you kind of think about the sorts of things that your students might learn when they're just beginning, learning how to say their name, learning how to introduce themselves, learning colors or numbers or animals or things like that. We all have, students at that age are still able to express themselves in their first language. So they're familiar with this idea of performance and of conversation. And I think it's just about providing the necessary support for them to do that in a second language in English as they go forwards. So of course it's going to be really simple stuff. And if they're just learning how to say their names or how to introduce themselves, then that's all they'll be doing. They're not going to go into an extended discussion about the weather or anything else. But the key thing, I think, is to make sure that we still have that balance in our lessons of preparation and rehearsal, so that there is a point in every class where the students are using what they know, even though what they know is relatively limited at that stage.
Thank you. And that's a really good point. Even the simplest things, what might seem simple, like introducing yourself, it doesn't require a very high level of English, and it is a task that we perform in the real world very often.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. Another question is more about specific skills. So this idea that the metaphor perhaps works very well with writing or speaking, but does the performance side of this metaphor lend itself to things like listening skills and grammar?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I should have mentioned this, because we had that example on the screen of what was really more of a reading lesson, where students were reading that story. And I suppose it's the times when we're thinking about rehearsal particularly, we're probably focusing more on productive skills. We're focusing on speaking and writing especially. But I think the metaphor is useful to just keep our focus on the fact that our students learn grammar for a reason, or they learn, they practice their listening skills for a reason, and that's so that they can then participate in conversation later on. So I think just keeping that that idea of the eventual performance in mind, even though it may not be immediately obvious when you're learning grammar, I think is useful. And you saw, like with students had the chant where they kind of repeat, what is it, Gordon the gecko? It's not Gordon, is it?
Greg
the gecko.
A different story altogether.
Yeah, they're repeating what Greg the gecko says, and there's a focus on grammar there because the structures are tightly controlled. But you can see how that could lead on to something more, to something freer and more improvisatory and rehearsal like later on. So yeah.
Students could be talking about what they've done, where they've been.
Yeah, that's what we want, because that's what they're going to be doing outside the class, hopefully.
Sounds great. I just noticed that some people are putting questions in the chat box, and I might be missing them. So if you do have a question, can you please pop it in the Q&A box?
There was one earlier from Vanessa that I saw, and I wasn't able to answer it at the time. So I'm going to go back to that, Vanessa, because it was quite a good one. She said, it was when I was asking you guys about your own activities and if they're preparation or rehearsal. And Vanessa said, oh, maybe bingo or tic-tac-toe could be both, depending on what the task is. And I think you're right, Vanessa. It depends what you're doing, really. And I think it also depends on whether you have your students doing these activities individually or if they're doing them in pairs or groups, because just having your students work together in a pair or in a group can transform an activity that would have been preparation into rehearsal, because they have to have that kind of more spontaneous, free conversation between themselves to complete the task, if that makes sense.
Vanessa says, thank you.
You're welcome.
I wonder, Matt, if you could say a little bit more about this idea with using digital tools. What can we imagine would be the ultimate performance for students in a sort of digital or online sphere, perhaps? What should we see as a sort of end goal for students in that situation? So not speaking to someone in real life and, improvising a small talk about the weather. But, when we talk about stuff based online and stuff that students have to produce digitally.
That's a good question. So I guess if we're talking about writing, then you can imagine the sorts of performance that students might do. It could be having a chat on WhatsApp with somebody. So it's the skill then is to be able to respond quite quickly and to write quite quickly. But if we compare that to writing with a pen, then you've got more support with spelling if you're using WhatsApp, because you can use kind of predictive typing. So it's slightly different to writing by hand, or kind of traditional writing, because there's a bit more, you're having to think a little bit quicker and react a bit quicker, but you're writing very short snippets of text. So in a way, it perhaps has more in common with a kind of face-to-face conversation than with traditional pen and paper writing. Maybe writing emails, things like that, filling in forms online. These are the kinds of digital performance that we might associate with writing. And when it comes to speaking, then it might be participating in a Zoom call, or maybe just or just talking on the telephone, that's old-fashioned technology now, isn't it? But that has its own challenges, because when you're speaking to somebody over the phone, that's harder, I think, often than face-to-face conversation, because you don't have the visual cues and the visual support that you could rely on in a face-to-face discussion. So these performance in digital spaces has its kind of own challenges, but also there are different ways of getting support as well in those spaces.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matt. I'm afraid that's all we've got the time for. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank our lovely presenter for this inspiring talk. Everyone who participated, you've been a really lovely audience. Thank you for joining us today. A quick reminder that Matt used examples from Supermind 2nd edition, and you can check out the material at cambridge.org/superminds2. You can also go to cambridge1.org to check out some of the digital tools. So there's a free demo for you to download. And congrats again on Matt's publication, From Teacher to Trainer. So keep an eye out, everyone. For that, I'm sure it's going to be amazing. And this is the second in a series of webinars for primary about teaching young learners. And I hope you can join us on the 27th of April. And we'll be joined by Herbert Puchta, sharing with us 5 things that we need to know to develop thinking skills in ELT. Yes, so that's 27th of April with Herbert Puchta. I hope you can join us. And thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Justina. Thanks, everybody.